Good morning, everybody. My name is Luis Camacho, and I'm about to give the talk on biosimilars today. Thank you very much to the PCMH Congress and the organizing committee, and of course to the NCQA for the invitation. So over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to speak with Ms. Patricia Barrett about biosimilars and, some of the valued strategies to improve the access and reduce the cost of biologicals in, at least in oncology from my standpoint. So the learning objectives for the next 30 minutes are, one, to describe the characteristics of the medical neighborhood model and data supporting the impact on quality of care, cost, and experience measures. How are we going to incorporate best practices from current oncology PCSPs into efforts to achieve the recognition standards set by the NCQA? And I will go a little bit more into the regulatory requirements for approval of biosimilars in America and to evaluate the availability in emerging biosimilars and how to integrate them into practice. So the topic of biosimilars is fairly new to the United States. Actually, we started really studying it in 2013 when the first biosimilar was in preparation for submission of their dossier to the FDA. That was Sarcio, which was approved in 2015. You can see that list that is now going to be an everlasting, ever-growing list of medications that will come to our marketplace. Just so you know, the EMA, which is the European Medicines Agency, they have approved about 26 agents over the past 10 years or so. So they're ahead of us, and they are collaborating with the FDA and making this a much smoother process for us. And this is a slide that I think it's very nice because it really explains to you the difference between a regular biological and a biosimilar. So the regular biological goes through a path called the 351A, and that path, as you see, is mainly focused on clinical trials and clinical data proving at the safety and efficacy of these agents. At the bottom of the blue column, you have about 50%, which is formed by the clinical pharmacology, non-clinical data, and a lot of analytical data that is presented to the FDA. On the contrary, biosimilars go through a 351K path, and their job is not to show safety and efficacy, but to show a high similarity with the reference product. And you will see some of those examples, and I hope at the end of today to convince you that, we are doing things the right way. And you can see how about more than 50% or 50% of that pyramid regulatory path is sort of formed by analytical data that have to be looked upon by the FDA and give the blessing before they move into clinical trials, which are usually very small trials and enough to just show similarity. So it's a stepwise approach program, and the FDA developed it that way because they want to have evaluation of the totality of the evidence. And with that, what they mean is to have the whole package looked at and see if that can be extrapolated to other indications. In other words, if your drug is approved for colorectal cancer, that is the reference product. If a reference product is approved for colorectal cancer, lung cancer, GU cancer, is the biosimilar showing enough data to make the FDA comfortable approving it for different indications, despite the fact that you may present data only involving one disease? And I think that is controversial, but that is also important because it really cuts the cost of development of these drugs. And so we have the analytical studies, animal studies, clinical PKs and pharmacodynamic studies, immunogenicity, which is also very important, and additional studies. And all these data are needed in order for the FDA to make an evaluation. Now, keep in mind that not every agent, not every process is the same. So if you are with one of the pharmaceutical companies or the sponsors trying to develop a biosimilar, the message from the FDA is do not be creative and do not be very proactive. Keep a close communication with the agency at all times so that they guide you as to what other pieces of information are needed and what clinical trials need to take place before your biosimilar moves on further in the process of approval. And here's just an example. This slide is a Trastuzumab, which is the reference is known as Herceptin, and this is pretty much what they show or what they have to present to the FDA before they move on to clinical data. It's an immense amount of information that have to convince the agency that the drug is very similar to the reference product. And I brought over the next 4 slides, I'm going to give you some examples of what the comparisons look like to reassure you of how highly qualified this process is. This is a comparison of peptides, and this is a chromatography assay looking at the peptides in each of the molecules. At the bottom, you have the reference product for Trastuzumab or Herceptin used for breast cancer and now gastric cancer. And at the top, you have a Trastuzumab biosimilar. Look at each of those peaks. Look how they show in the chromatography assay. And it's amazing how well that molecule matches the reference product. This one is a paper published in 2015, actually. It was known as, the agent was known as EP 2006, and that's the same Zarcio that we have approved in the United States by Sandoz. At the bottom, we have the originator, Filgrastim, or Neupogen by Amgen, from the European Union. In purple, we have the originator in the US. That's another batch. And at the very top, we have in red the biosimilar drug product, or Zarcio. And you can see how the matches, the peptides match in each of these spikes and make you very comfortable that is a drug that has no major differences and the structure is similar. Here's the coupling of the receptor that's measured in resonance units. You have it on the y-axis, and you see how different batches from both the originator and the biosimilar bind to the receptor in a very similar fashion. And here's the pharmacokinetic assay, a comparison between Zarcio in red and the U.S. licensed originator Neupogen in green. And you can see the behavior in times and in the geometric concentration is highly similar. This is an example of the way clinical trials are being conducted right now. This is a clinical trial looking at Zarcio in patients with advanced or regionally advanced breast cancer. And the purpose of this study was to show that since these patients get myelosuppression from the chemotherapy intended to shrink the tumor, then the administration of Filgrastim or the biosimilar was to prevent them from either dropping the treatment or getting infections. And so these patients, 218 patients, are randomized in 4 different arms. The first arm at the top you see is chemotherapy called TAC, which is a combination of docetaxel, adriamycin, and cyclophosphamide. And patients got 6 cycles, each of those represented by a square box there. And The four arms show what regimen the patients received. The top is all patients got TAC with the biosimilar in each cycle. The second one is TAC with Neupogen, each cycle for 6 times. And then look how creative the bottom arms are. One starts with the Sarcio and alternates between Sarcio and Filgrastim, and that's trying to see if changing one with the other one leads to the same outcome. When you look at the data were not different, and the conclusion of this paper was that treating these patients with either Filgrastim or the biosimilar was the same in terms of neutrophil recovery, rates of infection, and complications during the treatment. Now, please keep in mind that biosimilars are not generics, in the sense that generics have a very fixed chemical structure. You can pretty much develop them in your garage and without much difficulty. But biosimilars are made by living organisms, and as such, they change over time. And so this slide is very nice, and it became very popular, that graph from Schneider. I think he's a rheumatologist. This was published back in 2013, initially ignored by many, but then when you read and look at the number of times the changes in the manufacturing process of a biological over time is just amazing. You have a substance like Remicade that can go almost 40 differences in the manufacturing process. And yet, when you go to the hospital, when you go to clinic and you get another batch, you are buying the same label, the same brand, but it's a completely different agent. The FDA does not require to the companies that they submit a new dossier every time that they change the batch, because we know that once you establish the living organism and the manufacturing process, then we think it's similar enough that the outcome will be the same. And so this slide, just to show you how many times different compounds can change through time. This is a beautiful slide. It tells you the power of cost savings of generics. This only looks at 2014. In 2014, American pharmacists prescribed 4.3 billion or filled 4.3 billion prescriptions. All right? 88% of those were generic. The savings for America that year was $250 billion in generics. And between 2005 and 2014, the introduction of generics to the health market in America led to $1.5 trillion. So this slide is very powerful. It's really striking. I invite you to visit that. I think it's an online thing, and look at how generics can really decrease the cost of healthcare in our country. And this one is sort of to tell you that, okay, I already showed you that generics can do something really good in terms of decreasing costs. Let's look at biosimilars, and this is an exercise in Europe. Pretty colorful graphic there. You have 3 different molecules we're looking at, and you have on the x-axis you have all the countries in Europe, and what they did was they looked at the different biosimilars. So the red dots are hormone growth. The blue or sort of greenish dots were procreate derivatives, and the green ones were GCSF, growth factors for bone marrow recovery. And you see on the y-axis the penetration in each market based on the country that we look at. And if you look at for hormone growth, factor, you can see that there are countries that have not adopted it at all, like Ireland, which has about 0%, and then you have Poland that is about 100% using the biosimilars. All right. Now, if you take EPO, you can also see countries like Croatia with 0%, and it goes up to 60-70% in Slovakia, in Norway, and in Bulgaria, and it also goes that way. But regardless of the penetration, if you account for that, and you make your exercise, and you put all countries together, this is between 2006 and 2013, looking at the EPO markets, and look at the cost reductions based on how much of the biosimilars were adopted in those countries. You can see that if your country tends to be not only a first adopter, but a very heavily adopter, like Croatia, your costs can go down up to 81%. And then they can be down to 4% or 12% in Denmark or Italy that have not been very proactive in adopting biosimilars. That is where we get the number of 40%. When you put all that stuff together and you average them, it's about 40%. So the expectation in some of us is that biosimilars in America will decrease the costs of treatment with biologicals by about 40%, making it more accessible to patient populations that cannot afford it, and helping recover a market or an industry that is already heavily affected. And it's changed. When I started giving this presentation, there was a survey at a medical meeting, actually here in Orlando, that asked the physicians attending the meeting and the nurses if they knew what a biosimilar was, if they were comfortable with biosimilars, if they would use biosimilars, and it was a very negative survey. Most of us were really afraid. Most of us were very suspicious. Most of us were uncomfortable with the term biosimilar and treating our patients. Now, that was for supportive care, much less to treat patients that had diseases that could be potentially fatal. And here's sort of a follow-up to that survey. This is a much broader one. This was conducted by a group called Biosimilars Forum, which is all the companies that are interested in you guys and me liking the biosimilars. Little bias there, but nonetheless, is an exercise that is done to try and see what's the perception of the medical community after we introduce education and we sort of spread out the work that the FDA has been doing. And you can see that they targeted different physicians or physicians involved in different patient specialties: dermatology, GI, hem-onc, med-onc, nephrology, and rheumatology. The survey was 19 questions. It was published by Cohen and others, and it included 1,200 physicians. And these are sort of the breakdown by the specialties. The questions were whether they felt that biosimilars were safe and effective after first or second line therapies for their patients. And you see the blue is they felt that it was safe. And yet the orange was in disagreement. That meant that those physicians were not in agreement or felt that the adoption of biosimilars was not going to be safe. And you can see that there are specialties like hematology, oncology, and medical oncology that have a better perception of biosimilars than others, such as GI, derm, and rheumatology. I believe at the time we had focused more education on hematology, oncology, because the first biosimilar was Zarzio, which is a growth factor. But I also think that once all specialties start experiencing with the use of biosimilars and understanding their safety and efficacy firsthand, then we're going to be more comfortable. And this slide goes on to show you that still physicians don't think that they are as safe, and they don't feel comfortable with an abbreviated pathway. The problem with not having an abbreviated pathway is that it'll increase the cost of development, and that's going to pretty much defeat the purpose of having biosimilars. These are the number of physicians in that group that had concerns about patients' compliance or access to biosimilars, and you can see that about somewhere between 50 and 60% of physicians agree that there's still going to be a problem with compliance and access. And then there's prescribers that feel comfortable, at least now it's a bit over 30% of the patients, of the physicians feel more comfortable with biosimilars. What gives you comfort in adopting biosimilars for your daily use in clinic? I put together this list, and I think it bottoms down to trust. I believe that we are blessed in this country to have an agency like the FDA. I've not always been happy with the FDA or with the FDA decisions I have to disclose, but I think we are blessed to sit here and feel that someone is doing a great job in DC, making sure that the population and that we are safe. And the reason I say that is because many of the biosimilars approved worldwide would have never passed the processes established by the FDA or the EMA. And that is pretty scary. These companies are making millions of dollars, but they don't have molecules that could be submitted to the FDA. That's why I think that we are very lucky and privileged to have an agency like the FDA here. Now, so I think that, it makes me more comfortable if my drug is approved by the FDA or the EMA. It also makes me more comfortable if I have the chance to look at the data. I'm not going to read every single submission packet, but when I started talking about this, I went on and I went to the FDA website and I downloaded this RCO submission materials. And I have to disclose, I have no business with Sandoz. I don't like them. I don't know anything about Sandoz. But it's one of the most beautiful packages that I've had a chance to read. It's very well written, very well done. Every single question in your mind is answered in that package. And I wish that we had a chance to read it. And I encourage people who are trying to submit a biosimilar to go over that package because it's so easy to review and to approve. And then I also think that we need drugs that come from sponsors that have a track record and have a reputation in the medical community and with patients. I think that physician education is very important. And over time, gaining experience dealing with biosimilars. And one last thing is, I also think that a pharmacovigilance program is of critical importance. Because if we get biosimilars approved, and God forbid one of those end up having very bad complications in one or a group of patients, that's going to open a hole in our trust, in our embracement of biosimilars in the community. What are the potential challenges? Again, this is a list that I put together. Safety is always a concern. Some of us feel that those trials are too small for us to say or to get signals of safety. Efficacy is also a concern that has been brought up in different surveys. Some of us feel that the trials are too small to detect differences in efficacy. The third issue is people are many times skeptical about the cost savings that we're going to have. Are we really going to save a lot of money, or is this going to start a market battle, and before we realize both agents are going to be equalized at a level much higher than we expect? Sponsor, I also think it's a challenge. There may be small companies that want to come in the market and they have great products, and we're not going to allow them to come to the market because they're already established names that we trust a little more. And the experience, maybe we have a biased perception and we think that, well, I used to treat patients with Neupogen, they used to recover a lot faster than with this new biosimilar. And again, the biosimilar, the pharmacovigilance program, I believe companies are not doing the homework. And I already looked at it in different drugs that have been already approved, and the pharmacovigilance publications are very scarce. I looked at Trastuzumab, I looked at Rituximab, and I looked at Bevacizumab, and those three drugs have been approved for over a decade, and there's no more than 5 studies or 5, prospective articles telling us about the safety issues with those drugs. These are the ones that are under approval. In terms of supportive care, we have the Procrits, Filgrastim, we have the biosimilars that are competing with Neupogen, and then Pegfilgrastim is Neulasta from Amgen, and we have biosimilars already under development to try to compete with Neulasta. In terms of therapeutic agents, we have Avastin, Rituximab, and Trastuzumab or Herceptin. And here's what's going on. Bevacizumab, I already showed you in the first slide that there's already an approved drug, ABP 215. A little controversy because, as I was explaining to you, it was developed in lung cancer with extrapolation to colorectal, and some of the critique includes the fact that they wanted to see clinical trials in colorectal. Do I think it makes a difference? I don't think so. Again, because of all the analytical data that were presented, that were reviewed by the FDA, and the clinical data showing exactly the same safety and efficacy as the reference drug. But these are the clinical trials. Again, if you look at the table, it's all in patients with non-small cell lung cancer, and the endpoints were overall response rate, because survival would require not only a number of patients, but a time that would be tremendous. For Rituximab, it's tested in low-grade lymphoma. These are the trials that are ongoing. I think you may have your slides in your packages. If you have any questions, you can email me and I'll be happy to provide them. So Rituximab, I think we're going to have a biosimilar coming up pretty soon. And Trastuzumab already received the blessing by the ODAC committee, and I think that's going to be approved fairly soon. These are the clinical trials, all in HER2 positive, because that's the mechanism of action of Trastuzumab. And so in summary, I think there is a rapid shift in the perception of biosimilars in oncology over the last 5 years. I think most of us are now more comfortable with introducing biosimilars in our practices, in treating our patients with biosimilars, and both in the supportive care arena and also in the therapeutic arena. Now, another issue that comes often is, are you going to treat in the front line or in second line? Front line, where the intent most of the times is to cure. And so that's something that we're working on as well. I also think that, it is critical that the agency places enough attention in pharmacovigilance, because that's going to reassure us that whatever we are doing here is being taken care of, and the follow-up is telling us that we are right in adopting these agents. But I think that beyond FDA encouragement, we as community will have to be vigilant for signals of excessive toxicity and report them, so that will in turn prompt an investigation within the government to follow a particular biosimilar if indeed there's something we are concerned about. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions and or to let Dr. Barrett proceed. Thank you very much for your attention.
There's actually a good question here. Go ahead. curious in terms of how you incorporate this work in your, perhaps in the oncology care model that you may have been participating in as part of a bundle from CMS or as part of the oncology medical home model with NCQA.
Okay, so let me tell you quickly two real examples. I had a patient I was treating for liver cancer, and that patient had advanced cirrhosis with splenomegaly, portal hypertension, and neutropenia. And I put him on Neupogen. He could not afford it. He came back, he said, I could not afford it. And I switched him to Zarzio, and he was so happy that he was able to afford it, okay? And I believe him, I may be wrong, for 10 shots, I think I had him on 1 or 2 weekly shots, okay? And his copay was like $105. However, because of that experience, I started prescribing more Zarzio. And it's been declined by the insurance companies 3 times because it's a non-formulary drug. So go figure, all right? So that's one. I'm just exploring how is it going to go. But the other thing that I find it more important than Luis Camacho and his clinic is how are hospitals going to react and how are they going to start strategizing this. I don't think physicians are going to have a lot of, how do I put it in a very nice way? Yeah, power sounds too powerful. Autonomy, in terms of deciding what to do. If I have a patient in Houston right now and I admit him for the treatment of fever-related neutropenia or, fever associated with neutropenia after chemotherapy, I'm not allowed to use Neupogen unless I give a justification of it. And the hospitals are using not a biosimilar, but a second drug that is much cheaper. And they have it in Epic or in the EMR as a generic Filgrastim, and they just give the other agent. So I'm okay with that. I mean, I don't have any evidence or any data proving that one is better than the other one. But my point to you is, I think at the end of the day, insurance companies will dictate what you have to use, and hospitals, through the pharmaceutical committees, will tell you also what to use based on individual contracts and affiliations between the hospitals. I mean, seriously, I don't think that single physicians in the community are going to make a difference. But I'm very optimistic, I'm usually not, about the graph that I showed you with the generic savings. And I think if that happens, even close to those numbers, we did a good homework and we did it right.
Great.
Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you for that question that actually helped to bridge over to the medical home model in oncology care and how NCQA's program is looking to help address those issues of the triple aim to improve the value of the care that's being delivered. I think we've got a couple of slides here that talk about the reasons why cancer care was an appropriate target for applying the medical home model and a more coordinated approach. In particular, fragmentation and communication identified as a significant issue by the Institute of Medicine that needed to be focused on in cancer care. NCQA has been working to build a series of programs that interrelate with one another to help establish a medical neighborhood that is well connected, that communicates with one another, that puts the patient at the center of things, that helps to identify what their needs and priorities are, and then helps to bring a whole system of care to bear on their healthcare needs. So we have a series of programs, the patient-centered medical home that we've been spending the last 2 days on, and then our specialty practice program, which builds out from there and says what is the role of a general specialists in the medical neighborhood and how do they interrelate. The connected care program we haven't talked about as much, but it's the program for the episodic care providers typically. Urgent care centers have been the ones that have taken that up the most, but worksite centers and others are also eligible there. And then the Oncology Medical Home is the program I'm here to talk about today, which really adapts the specialty practice program to the oncology-specific environment. Among the many reasons why cancer care was a first target for adapting and sort of personalizing the specialty practice program to one particular specialty are things like this slide identifying what CMS showed as the payments, and huge dollars in this particular space, and we know that we have an affordability problem in the U.S. Dr. Camacho was able to talk about some strategies where you could use different the biosimilars in order to help identify ways of making some savings happen. Some of the aims of our specialty practice program I've already touched on, communication and coordination across that medical neighborhood, making sure that information exchange is done on a timely basis, having good referral processes, but also access to care, clearly important, in particular in cancer care, critical to make sure that patients' needs can be met on a timely basis in order to help avoid those more intensive, costly, and less safe environments for patients going through chemotherapy and other treatments. Getting yourself connected to a hospital is probably the least healthy place for you to be. And also we wanted to make sure we were aligning back in the day when we first created PCSP with meaningful use, but now with the oncology care model and certainly MACRA and MIPS, making sure that our programs are well interfaced with that, helping to prepare practices for a new value-based payment environment. We certainly have seen a lot of different challenges in the specialty practice space than in the medical home, the primary care space. You've been working in primary care on this model and this approach, team-based approach to care, putting the patient at the center, so forth, for a lot longer. That's not to say that specialists have been, ignoring their patients, but in primary care it has been a shift. It is a transformation in the approach, more proactive, more information seeking. Our speaker last night talking about compassionate care. Certainly, cancer care providers are familiar with this model, with this idea of the importance of connecting with the patient, understanding their needs, helping to comfort them in a time of a great deal of stress and fear. However, it's still not been an environment where team-based approaches to care have really been the norm. And so that's been a particular challenge that practices have faced. We also find that in the specialty space, a lot more unrealistic assessments of their current capabilities, their current infrastructure. We had a great experience working with Dr. John Cox down in Texas. He was one of our early adopters and was on our committee in developing the first patient-centered specialty practice program. And he, was like, oh, we've got this. This is, these standards are tough, but they are, they're the right things, and I'm sure we're doing all these things. And then he sat down with his office manager and with his staff and identified how little of what was in this program was actually documented and being done on a consistent basis. So really important to make sure that you understand what's really happening in your practice, assess realistically where you are, and then look to make the changes that are appropriate. If you were at yesterday's cancer talk with Dr. Patel, you saw this slide really just trying to bring together how patients are at the center of this program of cancer care at large, and the clinician-patient interactions being an important, the first line of cancer care, and then the rest of the workforce making sure that things like expanding access in order to reduce costs and reduce those undesirable ER and hospitalizations, guideline-based care, improving treatment outcomes, and then the patient engagement and personalization of your care, really improving the patient's experience. So really hitting on all parts of the triple aim. We also talked yesterday about some of the recent studies identifying how the patient-centered medical home model applied in cancer care can lead to some significant successes. And this particular study is the one that I mentioned about Dr. John Sprandio in Philadelphia area and his practice, and how they saw in an early adoption of the model pretty significant improvements in their hospitalizations and ER rates, reducing lengths of stay as well. Every day that a patient's not in the hospital is a day that they're spending with their family. That's can't be emphasized enough how important that is. Also mentioned, I believe this one is from, let me make sure I get the right reference. This is from Dr. McEnany's Come Home program, which was funded by CMMI and applied many of the principles that we've now put into our oncology medical home program requirements. With these reductions, they saw a $2,000 per member per month, per patient per month, reduction in their costs of care. I mean, that is remarkable. Also improvements in the spending near the end of life. So again, acknowledging that care needs to be provided that is comforting and supportive and curative when that's possible, but also acknowledges when that is not the case and make sure that you broach those subjects early on. And this one is related to NCQA's PCORI-funded study where we worked with a group of practices in Philadelphia and likewise saw improvements in quality and some patient experience indicators. The program wasn't, in our view, long enough in order to find the cost savings that we were looking for. There was a lot of change that was happening in those practices, and change is initially disruptive and can lead to just some inefficiencies. And so it was, we think that over time, those practices are identifying ways in which they can do even better and start to see those other improvements that we're hoping for. And this one was new to me. I haven't actually read the study itself, but it was something that NACCME had done in another conference, this Clear Value Plus decision-making tool, but I thought it was a nice tie-in to the clinical quality and the use of evidence-based guidelines. I think that this program is based on NCCN's guidelines for cancer care and significant improvements in the adoption of those pathways when you have good decision support tools that help to guide you towards the right care at the right time. So, I think I don't need to talk further about why we did this program, and I have talked before about, we took in all of these inputs in order to help shape what should be an adapted version of the specialty practice program for oncology. The program itself is still in the process of shifting over into our new redesigned model of care, redesigned model of the program delivery, the recognition program. So it will look like the PCMH program soon in next year when we release it, but the current version is still on the old platform. So it's a 3-year recognition. It's on that old ISS system, and we have adapted a few of the tools, the new mechanisms that we have in place to conduct reviews with a virtual review process. So there's sort of a hybrid in our approach to delivering this particular product at this time. It does bring in the specialty practice program requirements and expects practices to achieve at least at a level 2. We think you need to have that foundation of good, strong systems and processes and communication mechanisms, and then layers from there some expectations that are very specific to oncology care. Many of these do overlap and provide credit for PCSP-related standards, and you can see that all in the publication. It highlights, which core PCSP standard is met when you meet the oncology-specific ones. So the highlighting of what the specialty practice program addresses, it very much looks similar to PCMH with the exception of this working with primary care and other referring clinicians, making sure that that initial referral and smooths that communication process from the beginning. We then wanted to focus in on a set of standardized clinical performance measures. We would love to get to a place where we can actually judge these practices on the outcomes that they're able to achieve using good, solid, standardized measures. There is still a ways to go in terms of creating measures that are reliably comparable from one practice to another. We are working with groups like ASCO and COA to help to enhance. ASCO has a great set of COPI measures. I can't remember what that acronym stands for ever, but quality something. It's a great starting point, and they have done a lot of work to enhance those measures. We used them in our PCORI project, for example, and they are among those measures that we've listed as eligible for reporting in this. But we also wanted to include additional OCM measures and measures that are included in MIPS so that practices that are participating in any of those value programs would have the opportunity to use the measures that they're reporting for those purposes to report for this program as well. Oncology practice responsibilities, we wanted to shift the emphasis from the role of the practice, of the specialty practice in providing input into primary care and to an overall care plan to their more central role that they play when a patient has cancer and is in active treatment for their condition. And that they need to be the first point of contact. There's importance in emphasizing that on an ongoing basis, making sure that patients really do understand how to get in touch with you at any point in time when they need advice or intervention. The comprehensive health assessment draws from what was in patient-centered medical home program requirements, but not in PCSP. We didn't want to repeat the sort of comprehensiveness of primary care with specialty practices, but in the case of oncology care, critically important that they have a really good understanding of the full spectrum of needs of the patient, can provide that integrated care experience. And then there's a number of cancer-specific items included in this comprehensive assessment that we expect, including measures of distress, goals of treatment, making sure that you fully understand patient preferences and their goals for their care. And then evidence-based pathways, making sure that those pathways that showed improvement, if you do systematically adopt them, if you create a mechanism by which providers can be prompted and reminded of what the evidence says is the right treatment pathway, but not locking them in to 100% of the time needing to follow that one particular pathway because it might not be the appropriate one for the patient that's in front of them. So ability to tailor that, but be reminded of what is a standardized pathway. And then coordinating patient-centered support, important to be doing care coordination across the entire neighborhood, particularly important in cancer care, to be connecting the other cancer treatment providers, but also nutrition and social services, and particularly financial services, recognizing again that cost of care that is so dramatically higher in cancer, assuring that patients can get access to the care that is going to be potentially curative and life-changing for them. So that covers how NCQA has done an adaptation of our specialty practice program for cancer care, and we're now open for questions for either of us. Thank you. Yes. So the oncology medical home is not specific to adult versus pediatrics, but would be we haven't directly worked with many pediatric oncologists now that I'm thinking about it, and I'm not sure that actually any of our specialists, the pediatric specialty cancer center that was part of it. Anyway, it would be great to talk to you to see if there are ways in which the program doesn't actually fit to pediatric oncology. But in general, it's our sense that it would be applicable. Yep. So the Oncology Medical Home Standards themselves were just released this past summer, right? And the updated version of them that will align with the new core and elective criteria will be released. The official version on QPass will come out in June, is when we expect to release it on the system and be able to start enrolling practices into the new version. You can come through the old version now, and we will release the standards sometime earlier in the year, but we don't have a specific date yet. It will ultimately have an annual reporting model as well, just like the PCMH program. So we don't yet have those annual reporting requirements laid out, but they'll look similar. Any other questions? I think we can get you off to your next session then. Thank you very much.